And that was just the fair food. That was not like the meals that I ate outside of the fair. I went through 3 funnel cakes, not in a day. I thought about it, but I didn't find out that they took credit card at the funnel cake stand until the last day, which is a good thing because otherwise it would have been like 3 funnel cakes a day instead of. And unfortunately, like I'm not the kind of person. I don't do that like normal plain funnel cake stuff because I'm a real man. I went for the strawberry cheesecake one. For the record, if you didn't get a strawberry cheesecake one and you're a man, sorry, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, but step your game up and get one next year. They were super good. I mean, this thing was like this. I mean, it's fried bread. There's no way around it. It's like deep fried bread, let's just be honest. And then they just take a slice of cheesecake, they slap that on there, and then like strawberries that are 90% sugar at that point because they pretty much just sit in like this syrup. That went on there. And it was like, and if that's not enough, there's this like icing that they put on there. And I was like, this is good. I didn't have one the first day because I maxed out all my money on fish sandwiches, which is what I was told I had to do. So I got like, I probably went through 4 or 5 fish sandwiches in the past 4 days. I'm not proud of it, but I kind of am because I feel like I'm finally getting acclimated to being here. I went through 2 or 3 things of fries, which they're like the real fries, which, you know, those are really good, and so I had more of those than I ever should. A few hot dogs. I went through 3 hot dogs.
Only 3?
Only 3 because I also got a bunch of fish sandwiches and stuff. 1 pork burger, which I didn't even know was a thing. After they started frying it instead of grilling it, so that was really good and really not healthy. I think that's it. I don't think I ate anything else, which that's it is like, that's a big overstatement, maybe understatement, depending on how you look at it. I ate a lot of food, way more than I should have, especially considering I started a diet during the fair. So that didn't go too well. I definitely lied on the app, which I know I shouldn't admit to, but I lied on the app that said, did you have any cheat meals? I said no, because I was like, I'm not restarting. And technically, it just said follow a diet. It didn't say what kind of diet.
So it's a seafood diet.
Yeah. I technically followed a diet. I ate food, which is technically dieting. Seafood diet. I saw it, I ate it. That was my diet, and now I can start the real one, now that the fair is over. But I had an absolute blast. Eddie Montgomery, didn't know who that guy was until I got here. And it was really weird because I didn't grow up on country music, admittedly. 1, I'm from the city. 2, it was like frowned upon. 3, my mom pretty much only listened to the Christian stuff, to the Jesus stuff. And my dad really only listened to like classic rock. So there was very little in between. The only time I ever listened to country music was with my sister and my brother-in-law when I was like a kid. And I didn't like it. But there was one song in particular that I did like. And it turns out that song was by Montgomery Gentry. And I did not know that until he did it at the concert last night. And I was like, wait a second, I know this song. I was 9, but I don't know why I know this song. It was the song Gone. It wasn't even like the big one that most people know. I guess that was a big one, but you have to understand, my version of big is like whatever Apple tells me is popular because I don't know what his big hits were. So Apple said that was not one of the most popular, but it was back in 2004. And so it was a very awesome experience to hear that song and be like, wait a second, I semi-know about this person's existence, apart from him being on stage last night. So I had a really good time. One of the best fairs I've ever been to, which is saying not much because I've been to like 3, but that's not the important thing. It was better than the Moberly Fair, which Moberly is like bigger than Bell, so you know you would expect that one to be bigger. That one was average at best, but that's okay. The Belfair was like top notch. Not quite Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo level, but Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo is also, funded by like 2 million people, so kind of different levels. But I had a really good time. There's no real easy segue into the sermon from, me eating 50,000 calories and all that stuff, so we're just going to kind of hop into it. So I do want to start with a story about my life. When I was younger, so the segue is like right around the time I would have known about Montgomery Gentry, sort of. There's a rough segue for you. When I was a little kid, I remember I had a conversation with my mom one time that really threw her off because I was probably right around 9 or 10, still working on my English vocab, not really sure what words truly mean, not fully understanding differences in words. It's that kind of thing where you say a word that you've heard before thinking that it's another word. You know what I'm saying? When you're kind of that age. So I was sitting in the back seat. My mom was driving. I'm pretty sure we were on the way to church, actually. And I remember I told my mom, I said, "Mom, I'm anorexic." That word, for the record, is not the same as ambidextrous, which is what I thought I was saying. One makes your parent really proud, one does not. One is very concerning, and the other is like, "Oh, my kid's super talented." So I thought that I was like really good at using both hands. Turns out I'm not. But as a kid, I thought I was. And so just on the back seat, I was like, "Mom, I'm anorexic." And she was like, "You're what?" And I was like, "Yeah, Mom." And she was like, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "I can use both hands." And she was like, "Oh, thank God." Because it's like, when you have a 10-year-old who's struggling with not ambidextrous, you got a problem. And so I remember that happening, and I always wanted to be left-handed. I knew some people who were left-handed, and for some reason they seem to always have an advantage. Left-handed people, they just have this advantage over right-handed people because oftentimes you don't really know how to deal with left-handed people. Sports. I think of sports, right? So, especially fighting, because that's what I'm kind of doing and possibly going to get back into. I don't know, depending on how many times it sends me back to the hospital. So one of the things that I've always noticed is I've had to do like sparring and training, and it's like most of the time I stand with somebody and they're right-handed, and it's just like, it's kind of like that perfect balance where I'm like, okay, this is easy. Then occasionally I have to spar with somebody who's left-handed, and I'm like, wait a second, you're weird. Like, why are you standing like that? Have you ever tried to eat with somebody who's left-handed? Isn't it the worst? Because if you eat at a restaurant and you sit on the wrong side of them, it's like you're like bumping elbows all the time because they're trying to eat and you're trying to eat, and you're like, come on, just be normal. So I always wanted to be left-handed because I saw certain advantages. In the ancient world, that was not the case. In the ancient world, left-handedness was always kind of seen as this weakness, right? So, biblically speaking, a lot of the Psalms and some of the different passages in the Old Testament, they talk about God's right hand being opposed to people. And basically, the right hand signified strength. Right, so another thing was, in the New Testament, sitting at the right hand of somebody at a dinner was often seen as this place of glory. So the host got the most glory, and whoever sat at the right hand got the next most glory. Left hand, you're kind of third place. Sorry. And so the reason that this is important is as we get into the story that we're looking at today, we're going to be looking at the story of Ehud, the left-handed assassin. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Judges chapter 3. And to kind of break this down, if you remember from last week, I talked about how the Israelites during the time period of the Judges, they would often fall into sin They would then be oppressed by another nation. And then afterwards, they would repent and call out to God for help. God would give a warrior, a judge, to come and save Israel. And then they would have this time of peace following the time of the judge. So last week, we talked about Othniel. I'm going to say that a little differently so that it doesn't sound like oatmeal like it did last week. So we talked about him and we talked about his period. Now we are at a period where Othniel has passed away. Israel has experienced 40 years of peace. And now Israel is once again turning away from the Lord. So we're going to pick up in verse 12. It says this. Maybe we can put that up there. The Israelites again did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He gave King Eglon of Moab power over Israel, because they had done what was evil in the Lord's sight. After Eglon convinced the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join forces with him, he attacked and defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms. The Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he raised up Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed Benjaminite, as a deliverer for them. The Israelites sent him with the tribute for King Eglon of Moab. And I want to pause there. So, there's a couple of interesting things that pop up in this portion of the passage. For one, this story is like one of my favorite stories in the Bible. If you're familiar with the story, it's the kind that really sticks out to you because of what happens and sort of the graphic nature of this story. It's a great story, especially when you're like a teenage kid and you're like, that's in the Bible? I thought that this book was super boring. And then you hear this story and you're like, wait a second, this is pretty great. But I want to point out a couple of things. One, the very first thing that's mentioned is that Ehud is left-handed. Now, as I stated earlier, being left-handed was seen as this sign of weakness. It was this more or less a disability. It was not normal. It's still not the most common thing. Most people nowadays are still right-handed, and in the ancient world, that was the case. And being left-handed was seen as a disability. It was seen as something where you were kind of powerless. It was the right-handed people who were seen as a threat. And that's going to be important here in a second. The next thing is that Ehud is a Benjaminite. Now, the importance of that is that the tribe of Benjamin was the smallest tribe out of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were the smallest tribe. Benjamin was the youngest brother. Now, you got to understand, in our culture, oftentimes the youngest child is kind of seen as the baby of the family. Right? And in my case, the one who's loved more. Because I'm the baby of the family. And if you are the baby of the family, then you get that. You understand what I'm talking about. Oftentimes, you're the one who's spoiled most of the time. That was not the case in the ancient time periods. The oldest son was the one who got most of the birthright. They were seen as the most authoritative. They were seen as the strongest. They were supposed to be dad's successor, the one who was going to step in. So in times of kings, pretty much throughout monarchy as a history, the oldest son was always the one who stepped into the kingship next. And so, in this period of the Bible, that is still the case. The oldest son is seen as the top dog. We think of the tribes of Judah and the tribes of Reuben, the older brothers who were kind of the big tribes that got the most land. Benjamin got some of the least amount of land, had the smallest tribe, and was one of the weaker brothers, seen as one of the least. His only good thing was that he was Jacob's favorite wife's son. That was the consolation prize. It's like, yeah, you're the youngest, but at least, you came from my favorite wife. And it's like, well, thanks a lot, Dad. But that's important. And these two facts lead to our first 2 points. If we could go to the next slide. The first point is this. What others consider as weakness, God can use as strength. What others consider as weakness, God can use as strength. As we read on through the story, we are going to see that the fact that Ehud is left-handed plays into the way that God is going to use him. Because of the fact that right-handed people were seen as a threat and left-handed people were seen as mostly disabled, we are going to see God step in and redeem the quality of the perceived weakness. And the next note is this. We can go to that next slide. God often calls people who others consider unworthy. God often calls people who others consider unworthy. The people who are looked at and they're the small fry, they're the underdog. Those are the people that God often looks at and He says, I want you to serve my purpose. And these are both messages of encouragement that no matter where you come from, no matter what your past is, God can use you. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what you can or cannot do. God can use you. Let's pick up in the story, verse 16. Again, this is going to get kind of graphic. It's going to get kind of, if this got turned into a movie, it'd be a pretty good movie. Most likely rated R. It'd be awesome. So let's get into it. It says, Ehud made himself a double-edged sword 18 inches long. He strapped it to his right thigh under his clothes and brought the tribute to King Eglon of Moab, who was an extremely fat man. You know what's interesting about that word? We're going to pause right there. Just a quick side note. That word for extremely fat is also often translated as handsome. So, go with what you want. Whatever makes you feel better. I'm just kidding. It's a joke. You can laugh. Verse 18, it says this. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had carried it. At the carved images near Gilgal, he returned and said, King Eglon, I have a secret message for you. The king said, silence, and all his attendants left him. Then Ehud approached him while he was sitting alone in his upstairs room where it was cool. Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And the king stood up from his throne. Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into Eglon's belly. Even the handle went in after the blade, and Eglon's fat closed in over it, so that Ehud did not withdraw the sword from his belly. And the waist came out. Ehud escaped by way of the porch, closing and locking the doors of the upstairs room behind him. Ehud was gone when Eglon's servants came in. They looked and found the doors of the upstairs room locked, and thought he was relieving himself in the cool room. The servants waited until they became embarrassed and saw that he had still not opened the doors of the upstairs room. So they took the key and opened the doors, and there was their lord lying dead on the floor. He had escaped while the servants waited. He passed the Jordan near the carved images and reached Sirah. After he arrived, he sounded the ram's horn throughout the hill country of Ephraim. The Israelites came down with him from the hill country, and he became their leader. He told them, follow me, because the Lord has handed over your enemies, the Moabites, to you. So they followed him, captured the fords of the Jordan leading to Moab, and did not allow anyone to cross over. At that time, they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all stout and able-bodied men. Not one of them escaped. Moab became subject to Israel that day, and the land had peace for 80 years. I love this story because it's like super graphic, and it's like you get every detail. There's very little that's left out about what just happened. So, to break it all down, Ehud makes a sword, straps it to his right thigh because he's left-handed. So if you're left-handed and you have a sword, you're going to pull it from your right thigh because you're not going to try to awkwardly pull it this way. And so the reason that this is important is because kings of this day, they were not ignorant people. They knew that assassination attempts were things that happened. So often they would check the left side of your body to make sure that you didn't have anything you weren't supposed to have, because if you're right-handed and you're an actual threat, you're going to pull it from your left side. You're not going to pull it from your right side. And so they check his left side, and he has it hidden on his right side. And so in a matter of this awesome kind of like, it's very scenic. When you think of like movies, you know, Ehud's like, hey, I have a message from the Lord for you. And everyone's like, ooh, God's trying to talk to me. What's he got to say? And Ehud's like, yeah! And like, he's a very fat man, and the sword goes into his belly, and it goes so far in there that even the handle that Ehud's holding on to gets absorbed. And it's like, this blade's 18 inches long. Like, that's 1.5 feet. That's a pretty long sword. I mean, you know, it's not overly long compared to what we have nowadays, but at the time, that's very far to go into somebody. Let's just put it that way. And it says that the fat covers the sword. And all of his insides come out when this happens. This is like a very awesome, you know, gory kind of movie. Like, I'm telling you, if Hollywood just decided to like scrap most of their ideas, look at the Bible and say, you know, if we just stayed true to this, we could have a really great movie. We'd have a lot of really awesome movies, and this would definitely be one of them. And so, even to the point that there's humor, right? As this happens, in order to escape, Ehud locks the door and escapes kind of out the window. This is like some very movie stuff. And Eglon's guards that are standing outside, they smell the waste that has come out from being stabbed, and they think that he's handling business. And it specifically says they get to a point that they waited so long that it's embarrassing. They're like, man, this guy's been handling business for a really long time. Someone should probably check on him and make sure he's okay. Fun fact, he's not okay. And so they kind of unlock the door, go in to see what's going on, and their Lord is dead on the floor. Israel has been delivered at the left hand of Ehud. The very thing that was considered weakness, God used for strength. God raised up Ehud specifically in order to handle this problem that was plaguing Israel. And as a result, Israel is saved. They defeat the Moabites. They have 80 years of peace. And this whole story brings us to the overarching point, and it's this. We can go to that next slide. If you let God work in your weakness, you will win. If God calls you to something, it doesn't matter what your disqualifications are. God can step in if you allow Him, and He can work through them to bring victory just like He did to Israel. Now, it goes without saying that this all happens according to God's will. What I'm not saying is that, if your bank account is a little low and you say, you know what, I'm just going to place my weakness in God's hands and buy a lottery ticket that you're going to win the lottery. That's not what I'm saying. But we all have different struggles and fights in our life, different battles that we are in. Oftentimes we see different things about ourselves as being weakness. The temptation, the sin that we deal with, we look at our sheer willpower and we say, we just don't have enough to handle it. But if you allow God to step in and use your weakness, you will win. I find this story to be incredibly encouraging. I see a man who was looked down upon by his peers, a man who came from a tribe of pretty much nothingness. They were the little guy, the underdog. He was left-handed. He was seen as being disabled. And God steps in and uses this man to further his kingdom and to do his will. And the reality is that he can do the same with us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day that you've given us. God, I thank you for the fact that you work in our weakness. God, our ultimate weakness was that we could not bear the weight of our own sin. God, because of that, you stepped in and you worked in that weakness and you provided your Son who died on the cross so that we can have life with you. God, I pray that as we depart from here, as we recognize different weaknesses that we have, different battles that we face, God, that we would just pray and ask you to step in and work in our weakness. God, that you would lift us up and strengthen us. That where we are left-handed, that you would be right-handed. God, we thank you for your mercy and your grace. We pray all this in Jesus' name.